Hello. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, even if it's from the top of Missouri. I'm Dom's sister, Nikki Mungo, and Dom's sister, Gwendolyn Lesh, will be covering the second half of our presentation today. We are members of the Ordo Sororitatis Satanicae, a left-hand path and sorority and nonprofit. Our cloister is dedicated to the inspirational archetype of Lilith. We are pleased to provide this educational act of service in the Missouri Catholic Before she was said to be in the Garden of Eden, Inanna, the inspiration for Lilith, descended to the underworld. She met her death for a writing, was hung on a hook, and after 3 days, this hung goddess rose from the dead. Only she wasn't allowed to just return to life. What she did find was a husband who forsaken his marriage vows during her absence. Upon seeing his betrayal, demons conveniently dragged Inanna's husband back to the underworld to take her place. Now this tale may not be as pleasant as the one most commonly accepted by Americans today, where an angry, murderous, heavenly Father wasn't satisfied until his innocent son was crucified. And what offenses angered him to this extent that men dare work on the Sabbath? Is it so odd then that if we were to accept any arms at all, that we would prefer the metaphorical arms of a protective, independent mother rather than an abusive, tyrannical father? Lilith demanded and represents not only dissent, but personal sovereignty and independence of thought. She did not require the validation of others to follow her own left-hand path. This is why her archetype has remained meaningful across the ages, a source of inspiration to those who've been castigated, persecuted, shamed, and silenced. Whether over their gender, sexuality, or ethnicity, or even their personal healthcare choices, the arms of a protective, independent, universal mother would always be open to her children. We are all her willing to. When we dissent by making our intent to be treated as equals known, we make our persecutors feel uncomfortable. However, this is not a source of our motivation. Like Lilith, we seek only equality, not dominion over the thoughts and lives of others. And while we might be dissenters to the religion given primacy in this state, against the recommendations of the Missouri Constitution itself, this dissent is for a just cause, because we are equals. We hope you will dissent with us in loving those around us, in witnessing, and in knowing when to take a stand. The importance of the mother of dissent to Lilith philosophy now inverted. We can view America's history of dissent through a Lilith lens. Dwight D. Eisenhower once stated, "Here in America, we are descended in blood and spirit from revolutionists and rebels, men and women who dare dissent from accepted doctrine. As their heirs, may we never confuse honest dissent with disloyal subversion." Eisenhower was may be applied on any system of power so established. Susan B. Anthony, Frances Wright, Sarah Angela Grimke, Lucretia Mott, and numerous other women dissented by breaking gender roles and publicly speaking out against slavery and segregation. We like to think they were inspired by our women. The harassment and discrimination they endured formed the impetus from which the women's rights movement was born and is still being born, or is ever hopefully evolving. It is up to every American to consider our laws and determine their value. The American Civil War was an act of dissent by those who were subjugated, oppressed, and disgustingly relegated to property or compared to the chattel. These revolutionaries were assisted by those who believed in the value of humanity. When we consider the nature of American laws, remember always that at one point, slavery was not only legal, but widely accepted, and it was illegal to assist those trapped in human bondage. Remember always, it should be we the people who dictate these laws, and neither by a majority rule, nor by the state, one now currently set on a pro-discriminatory legislature, steeped in their religious desire to persecute those not to our lawmakers' faith. Behind every act of dissent, we find abuses of power by those in authority, whether imposed or elected. In many cases, these abuses of power include the willful erosion of the wall between church and state. I will end this brief history of past acts of American dissent with poignant words from the father and architect of the U.S. Constitution, our forefather and fourth president, James Madison. Americans would be wise to consider the architect of the U.S. Constitution's solid stance on matters of church and state. In the detached memorandum from 1817, locked in the archives of Madison's writings, Madison's support of an unbreachable wall between church and state were clear. In regards to chaplains and religion in government, Madison stated, in strictness, the answer to both points must be in the negative. The Constitution of the U.S. forbids everything like an establishment of a national religion. The law appointing chaplains establishes a religious worship for the national representatives to be performed by ministers of religion elected by a majority of them, and these are to be paid out of the national taxes. Does this not involve the principle of a national establishment applicable to a provision for a religious worship for the constituent as well as of the representative body, approved by the majority and conducted by ministers of religion, paid by the entire nation? The establishment of a chaplainship to Congress is a palpable violation of equal rights, as well as of constitutional principles. The tenets of the chaplain elected by the majority shut the door of worship against the members whose creeds and conscience forbid a participation in that of the majority. Thank you, James Madison. If the Missouri government is going to go against the wishes of the very architect of the U.S. Constitution by inserting their own religious ideologies into American government, resulting in laws that encroach upon our civil liberties, all at the expense of
in that it is only ideologically here for the moment. It is not an incorruptible stance. It is our charge that we endeavor to remain faithful to fact and to reason, and that we adapt to new information and events. Our appearance in the Capitol can be seen as an act of dissent. It is our duty to tell lawmakers in what ways they can better serve. Our ideal of their service is often not at the level which they perform. Many have fallen victim to their personal interests, lobbyists, or the peculiar demands of their religions, which overwhelmingly tend towards some brand of Christianity. Their values and lack of understanding of the sciences are evidenced in such things as the recently passed HB 126, which bans all abortions after 6 weeks, before most women could even possibly be aware of the fact that they're pregnant. This kind of legislation is arbitrary and penalizing. It comes from the zealotry which has sought to dismantle women's reproductive rights since the moment of the decision in Roe v. Wade. These lawmakers find themselves in the position of being the majority, and with great power and license, they have pushed for the ratification of their religion by their own agency of the state. What the majority wants is not necessarily for the health and well-being of all. That is, what is good for the greater number of people is not necessarily for the greater good. It is the difference between the decisions of the heated moment and the projections of our futures. Take, for instance, HB 728. In order to challenge arbitrary religious rule and religiously inspired laws, one would no longer have the protection of anonymity from the majority when bringing suit against the state and against lawmakers. The majority knows that among its ranks are the rabid and violent fundamentalists of their religion. To deny the protection of anonymity to the minority exposes them to the possibility of retaliation from these fundamentalists. Regardless of admission, it is obvious from the intent behind this, it is to discourage the minority from taking a stand against theocratic majority rule. We would argue that this is a policy of fear intended to intimidate. We disagree with any argument of necessity. We cannot concur with the majority on any would-be positive result of such a policy. It serves but one purpose: to silence us by making the courtrooms unsafe for us, our lives revealed along with our identities, our locations easy to find for those who would harm us physically and professionally. We see the truth of what they are doing, and we hotly dissent. Thomas Day once pointed to the Declaration of Independence and revealed the glaring hypocrisy of the statement that all men are created equal. What of the minority religions of the time? What of the minority ethnic groups? What of the minority and those who have been enslaved? The founding fathers themselves being slaveholders. How can there be equality for all if this only meant for some? The short answer is that it couldn't, and neither can it be the same model by which we function today. The majority would have us believe that their numbers translate to them somehow knowing what is best for us all. The majority rule is far from infallible. In the case of this legislature, many members have sought to legislate Christianity for all. Their beliefs on abortion, forcing public schools to teach creationism, or study their holy book in state-funded schools and classrooms. Dissent must come from a place of understanding what is best for the greater good, for the good of all, not merely a majority who sees their numbers as licensure to make decrees. Dissent must be the voice of reason and compassion that considers all players in this life. In this play, dissent is divine. It is the overarching and all-encompassing view which contemplates from a position of humanity and Martin Luther King Jr. practiced nonviolent civil disobedience to draw attention to social problems and garner public support through numerous demonstrations, marches, and addresses. Civil rights were furthered not by a sitting governmental system power, but rather by justifiable resistance by the disenfranchised members of society asserting their rights to fair treatment under the law. Dorothy Counts, at 15 years old, was one of 40 other black students across North Carolina who went into white-only secondary schools in defiance of an opting-out amendment to the compulsory school attendance law. This amendment permitted students the right to withdraw from racially integrated schools. These children took up the mantle to dissent against blatantly racist policies and endured ridicule, harassment, and even physical assault from other children and adults within the public education system. Malcolm X taught us that dissent isn't always polite. While he had his critics for suggesting that African Americans facing violence might have to stand up for themselves, he was a humanist saying, "I am for truth, no matter who tells it. I am for justice, no matter who it is for or against. I am a human being, first and foremost, and as such, I am for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole." And he put his principles first, even when the painful truth was realized about his own church. He spent the end of his life criticizing the sexual misconduct of the organization he had devoted his life to. He also rejected the last name he inherited from the slave-holding family of his pastoral paternal lineage. He then forged ahead to carve out civil rights advancements and space for the cultural identity of the disenfranchised black community. Stanislav Petrov taught us dissent can save the world. He defied protocol when early Russian warning systems detected 5 nuclear missiles launched by the U.S. against Russia. He had only a matter of minutes to launch a counterstrike, ending the world as we knew it. compassion, love. We ask that those assembled reflect upon these virtues in benevolent and noble service. We summon the embodiment of her divine inspiration. Guide our legislators in protecting the elderly, the disabled, and in honoring our veterans. To provide shelter and nourishment for those who have not. Guide them in thought and reason, with a deep respect for the equality and well-being of all. Love is the whole of the law. As these legislators move forward in their work on behalf of all their constituents, may they take every day in that solemn service as a renewed opportunity to reshape and refine their existence. Let the love and learning of our mother that our mother represents be the daily bread of any who would serve the people. From the universal mother we came, and back to where we go. May knowledge, reason, and fairness be the path to life, liberty, and happiness. Ave Luitu. The lecture and the invocation have ended. The Order of Sororitas Satanicae bids you peace, and will return to the House Rotunda on the date of our founding, Monday, March 11th. We will honor Lilith and discuss unity and diversity, our next act of educational service, ending with a special invocation to Lilith. Until then, care for each other.